This is Sanjay Notani, Senior Partner of the International Trade and Customs Practice at Economic Laws Practice, and you're tuned into the ELP podcast series on sanctions. Through this episode, we will delve into the complex landscape of sanctions with emphasis on the Middle Eastern and African regions. The Middle East, particularly the UAE, is an important transshipment hub, gateway to the world, and African businesses are also connected with UAE both for shipping as well as banking purposes. Importantly, India and UAE share a strategic relationship both in terms of connectivity of people and businesses, and more so, this is only expected to grow with the signing of the India-UAE CEPA. Accordingly, with India maintaining substantial trade connections with countries in these regions, as well as some other sanctioning countries like the US, EU, we'll explore the potential impact of sanctions on bilateral trade, notably in key sectors for India, such as diamonds. Moreover, we will not only uncover the far-reaching consequences of sanction law violations on businesses, but we will also shed some light on the strategies that are currently in place for, as necessary, for stakeholders to navigate the ever-evolving sanctions regulatory framework owing to geopolitical dynamics. To help us unravel these questions, we have with us today Mahmoud Fadlallah, in short known as Mac for us, is a partner in charge of the Akin, Gump, Strauss, Hauer and Feld's Dubai office. Mac counsels clients across a broad range of sectors on how US law applies outside the US, particularly with respect to white-collar investigations and trade compliance. Mac's technical experience spans OFAC sanctions, EAR, ITAR, and Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, FCPA. Beyond this technical experiences, which I've just mentioned, Mac also serves as a key advisor to sovereign governments and state-owned companies and has been appointed by board of directors of major multinational corporations as a trusted advisor to handle their most sensitive matters. In addition to this practice, Mac created and now leads Akin's support of Overruled, a machine learning enhanced legal data productivity platform for lawyers and compliance professionals. Hello, Mac. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Thank you, Sanjay. Pleasure is all mine. Thank you very much for having me.
Without further ado, let's dive into our first question. To set the context of sanctions regime in the Middle East and Africa, like India and other placed economies, do Middle East and African regions also not formally implement unilateral sanctions that are imposed by Western countries such as US, EU, UK? Are there efforts on behalf of the governments in the Middle East and Africa to align their frameworks concerning exports with global sanctions regimes?
Well, you've touched on a very particular area that I think the answer is evolving and there is a trend that is starting to form. So historically, I would say the answer has been no, right? Historically, what you found is the sanctions that are implemented locally are essentially that which is required to be implemented by the UN Security Council. So the UN Security Council will announce some form of sanctions, for example, against Libya or against ISIS or against Al-Qaeda, and you would find that countries across the world, in the Middle East and Africa included, would need to implement that into their local legislation to ensure compliance with those UN Security Council sanctions. Now, like all things UN, in order to get sanctions imposed by the UN, you need the 5 permanent members of the Security Council to be on board. So the types of sanctions that you saw implemented at the United Nations level were those that were, largely non-objectionable to the 5 permanent members, which means areas like, and I'm sure we'll get to sanctions imposed against Russia. Of course, that is a non-starter from a UN perspective, with Russia being one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. So historically, what you've seen is these multilateral sanctions, right? The ones that are imposed at the United Nations Security Council level being implemented in different ways within local legislation. Sometimes as simple as a central bank circular to ensure that certain financial transactions involving certain sanctioned parties do not proceed. But I don't think that historic answer is valid today. Right. And I think today what you're seeing is a trend that is starting to form in favor of what I would call either unilateral, or I'll introduce a new term here, plurilateral sanctions. So Plurilateral sanctions, we'll use Russia as an example, where you don't have the multilateral support of the UN Security Council, but what you have is the US, the UK, the EU, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and sometimes even Singapore that are kind of working hand in hand to implement similar restrictions across the board against Russia. Again, not at the multilateral UN level, but similarly not at the unilateral level either, where you have, for example, in the case of Cuba, the United States acting on its own. So what we're now starting to see is states, including in the Middle East, establishing more confidence in implementing either unilateral or plurilateral measures. So I can speak for the UAE. The UAE a few years ago announced its targeted financial sanctions program. So not only does the UAE impose sanctions and restrictive measures only on those parties that are prescribed by the Security Council, by the UN Security Council, but the UAE sort of looks at that as the floor, right? And creates space for itself to impose additional sanctions beyond those parties. And there have been those sanctions that have been imposed against individuals and against entities under various authorities within the UAE. So we have started to see the UAE act unilaterally, and that is a trend that I predict will continue and will proliferate to other countries in the region as well, where countries will start to take their own stances in accordance with their own national security and their own foreign policy interests.
Thanks, Mac. That was quite insightful. And let me just spend 3 seconds on that India particularly also follows exactly the same thing, where, the UN sanctions are put in process, and then India decides whether it wants to follow in its own domestic regulations and how it sort of wants to act upon it. So exactly the same. Now let's get me to the next question, which is, given that there is, in any case, growing importance of emerging technology in countries' national security and economic competition, we see countries implementing and enforcing controls on the export of critical technology, including things like chips, AI, quantum computing. We also understand that UAE also mulling over the implementation of export control for items such as chips and technology, given its road to bringing in technology and software from hubs like Bangalore or the Valley. Can you please shed some light on this?
Certainly. So just as like a fundamental point for our audience, export controls, when we speak about export controls, it's the policy purpose underlying that is essentially keeping sensitive items out of the wrong hands, right? So a lot of things, we sometimes refer to them colloquially as dual-use items, have very legitimate commercial applications, but at the same time could be used for military purposes as well. So what we see is that sometimes very typical day-to-day consumer goods that are being exported to Russia, components from those very goods, not the goods themselves, but components from those very goods are being found in weaponry that's used on the battlefield in Ukraine, right?
Okay.
So that is essentially a nutshell of what export controls is trying to tackle. It's keeping sensitive items out of the wrong hands. So to this question, what we've seen, similar to what we've seen on the sanctions side, right, is more and more countries are learning about the efficacy of these controls, right? They're actually seeing that there are legitimate foreign policy and national security objectives of the implementing country that are very well served by having these types of controls. To sweeten the deal, countries like the United States have announced incentives, right? Not financial incentives, but legal and regulatory incentives to say, for example, hey, India, we, the United States, will relax the controls on the exports of goods to your country if you give us confidence that you've implemented in your own local legislation controls against the re-export of those goods. So what we've seen is countries like the US really incentivize allies to implement similar controls, because although US export controls are extraterritorial, right? So the export of a US controlled item from the United States to India, controls continue to apply on that item for any re-export from India to another country, and sometimes even to in-country transfers within India. So what we've seen is a lot of focus on that, but also a desire on the part of the US to have another layer of defense in there, which is in the form of the local legislation. And we've seen a lot of countries, South Korea, for example, take note of that and start to implement changes to their local legislation in order to qualify for incentives on the US side.
Oh, thanks, Mac. So evidently, of course, there is a growing emphasis also on the implementation of sanctions and export controls now globally, after what we've seen in the past few years and decades, and possibly 2023. So how do you see the businesses, particularly in the Middle East and African regions, adjusting to sanctions? And have there been instances of reported violations? Specifically, what strategies are commonly being employed by entities in these regions to either act on these or alleviate the effects of sanctions on their operations?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So what I'll say as a broader comment is the pace of changes that we've seen in sanctions in the last couple of years is really 10x what the pace of change is that we're typically used to seeing. And with a lot of changes in law, we've seen that companies struggle to catch up with that and to remain in compliance. But with those changes in law that have occurred in 2022 and 2023, we expect the enforcement actions for that to be the theme of 2024 and 2025. So the sanctions violations that were occurring in 2022 and 2023, we won't really know about those until investigations start to get concluded and start to become publicly announced in 2024 and 2025. That said, 2023 itself was a near record year in terms of sanctions enforcement in the United States. It is very notable that when we talk about US sanctions enforcement, that the regulator, OFAC, right, which has the civil jurisdiction, the vast majority of the dollars that are going to OFAC are based on enforcement actions imposed against non-US entities, right? And for conduct that is occurring outside the United States. So we are dealing with a regulator that is extremely expansive in how it interprets its jurisdictional reach. Similarly, on the export control side, there is a particular focus area that the regulators have, and that's something that I think could be relevant to Indian companies. But looking at it from a US perspective, when US companies are trading with a particular entity, and that same entity is also trading with China and trading with Russia, or with other countries that the United States considers to be not aligned with its objectives, that is a company that is a focus area of US risk. If you have US tech companies, right, that are partners with an Indian company, and that same Indian company is also trading with Chinese and Russian entities, that is where US enforcement resources want to be focused, right? At the end of the day, the enforcement that we see is not against necessarily limited to Chinese and Russian companies, right? The shift that we're seeing in enforcement is to move outside and to move to that company or those companies that are sitting in the middle, right? Because rarely are you seeing a US company trading directly sensitive technologies with Russia and China. Instead, what you see is Russian and Chinese companies reaching out to, for example, companies in India and wanting to procure US technology from them. And the United States will not hesitate to go after the Indian entity as well as any of their Chinese or Russian counterparties. So I think that's an important point to highlight there in the way that enforcement resources are shifting and moving. We expect, and I think many commentators on the industry, I don't think it's just limited to me. We are expecting a major uptick in enforcement to occur in 2024 and 2025. And notably, right, these laws, sanctions laws are interesting because, and export control laws, they are both civil and criminal in nature. So OFAC and BIS and the Department of State with DDTC under the ITAR do not need to demonstrate that there was any intent whatsoever, right? These are what we lawyers call strict liability regimes. So you simply, as an Indian company, all you need to do is unknowingly make a mistake, right? And even if you unknowingly make a mistake, you are liable for at least a civil violation of law. And that civil violation is substantial, right? It's at least twice the value of the transaction, right? And it can be greater than that for multiple transactions. So that covers when you make a mistake. Where we're expecting to see an uptick in enforcement based on statements from the U.S. Department of Justice is the criminal enforcement side of things. And that is where there is some intent involved, where the company willfully has violated the law, and the U.S. can be very aggressive in asserting when conduct is willful conduct. So that's an important point to note. We've had the office within the Department of Justice has been significantly staffed up with more prosecutors to prosecute these cases. The Deputy Attorney General of the United States has stated sanctions and export controls criminal white-collar enforcement as a priority for the department. And we've heard other officials refer to sanctions and export controls criminal enforcement as the new FCPA. Right. And what we're expecting is that our part of the world collectively, right, just as Africa may have been the epicenter for FCPA enforcement, right, we're expecting, Middle East and India as well to start to become more of a focus for export controls and sanctions criminal enforcement.
Thanks, Mac. While you have answered my last question briefly, but let me just, for the sake of adding a new perspective to this, so how do you see Indian businesses collaborating with partners in your region, which is Middle East, proactively safeguard themselves against any risk of violating sanctions, since both governments now have also agreed to allow settlements of trade in Indian rupees? And also, as way of an illustration, given that UAE is a major hub for trading gold, diamonds, chemicals, and many other products, how do you see these sanctions impacting trade in these goods from now on?
Well, I see those industries that you just mentioned, and I'll mention the energy sector as another focus area. These are ones that I consider to be hot for enforcement. So if I were an Indian company in any of these sectors, right, trading with the UAE, I would consider, right, the risk of both what we call primary and secondary sanctions being imposed. And maybe it makes sense to just take a minute to explain. Primary sanctions are where you see the dollar value penalties. It's where a non-US entity, right? It could be a US entity, but for purposes of our audience, where a non-US entity does business in a manner that triggers US jurisdiction. And this is perhaps the biggest mistake that I see companies outside the US making, right? They say, oh, we're an Indian company, right? Therefore, we don't need to worry about US law. And that there's plenty before that I've tried, and it just does not work. The amount of effort that it takes to ensure that there is no US nexus in a particular transaction and therefore no US jurisdiction is immense, right? So we're not just talking about we are an Indian company. We're talking about we don't employ any US nationals, including dual nationals that are involved in the conduct. We're not doing business in US dollars. We don't have any US server infrastructure, right? That is, for example, hosted on a cloud, but backed up by servers that are in the United States. We have no presence or subsidiaries in the United States that are involved in the transaction. There is truly absolutely nothing American about our business transactions at all, and nothing that would enable a US regulator or enforcement agency to assert US jurisdiction over these transactions. Is it possible? It is, right? But it takes an immense amount of work. So the number of lawyers you need, right, to confirm that the number of US lawyers you need to confirm no US jurisdiction is more than the number of US lawyers you need as if you were a US company, right, where US jurisdiction is just assumed. And even if you do that, and this is what I think is the major takeaway, even if you successfully remove every nexus from every US nexus from your business operations, you still run the risk of so-called US secondary sanctions, right? And these US secondary sanctions require no US nexus whatsoever, and they instead target players and entities that are doing business in a manner that is inconsistent with US foreign policy and national security interests. And it's not as broad and as vague as that. There is a specific there are specific bases. There are over 600 of them. I think over 600 specific bases. That's part of what Overruled is for. It indexes each of these bases. So if we really want to take the view, right, for example, as an Indian company, that the transactions that we are engaging in do not carry sanctions risk, we need to know, number one, whether there's any US jurisdiction over our transactions. And then even if the answer is no, we need to ensure that the nature of the business that we are conducting is not incompatible. It does not breach any of these 600 plus bases of secondary sanctions that the US can use to impose sanctions on a non-US entity. So this, in a nutshell, is the reason why we as Akin are able to support a substantial US white-collar investigations and trade compliance practice outside the United States. It's because most of the enforcement that we're seeing is outside the United States, and being here enables us to see it firsthand.
Thanks, Mac. While I don't have the luxury for a last question, but I will take this.
Sure.
Give me a little insight about what is Overruled. Since you are the creator of Overruled, just explain us what is Overruled so that we can ask our readers to sort of subscribe to this, to ensure that this becomes one of the tools for doing business as part of their day-to-day compliance. And clearly, it's something which is, like you said, it's evolving, it's complex, it's real, it's happening too fast. So how does Overruled help us?
Thank you for the question. So Overruled at a high level is a legal data productivity platform. So what we are doing is we are introducing different modules onto Overruled. And the ones that we should focus on are our sanctions module and our export controls module. What those modules seek to do is to keep our clients up to date on what the positions are of the relative agencies that are enforcing in this area. Part of it was born out of necessity. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the pace of changes that we saw there, we frankly did not have the capacity to draft a memorandum updating our clients, even when they were requesting it, about every single legal change. So we instead found a solution that worked out better for our clients and enabled us to still drive value for them and to meet the demand, where they would subscribe. Right? They would subscribe to these updates and to this platform to enable them to essentially receive that memo, right, on each change in the law as it relates to Russia. We also now have a China center that's on there. So each change in the law as it relates to Russia and China, they get that memo from Akin that updates them on what that change is. And they do it on a subscription basis that is at a fraction of the cost of what it would have been to request a memo on each of those changes. We also have consolidated for each of these agencies all guidance and FAQs that they've put out. Unhelpfully, although these agencies do a good job at putting out guidance, it's scattered across different parts of the web pages and is often very difficult to find and even more difficult to search. So what we've done is we've consolidated that into a single universal search so that if you are, for example, searching for enforcement actions against Indian companies in the energy sector, right? Instead of spending 20 hours on OFAC and BIS's website, you have 3 clicks on Overruled that get you that answer. If you're searching for guidance on how to deal with an entity that was designated on the BIS entity list, right? You can spend hours searching for that on BIS's website, or you can do it in a couple of clicks on Overruled. So that's part of what we're looking to do. We're aiming to be the one-stop shop for research in the modules that we have launched, which for now are sanctions and export controls. Notably, I should say our sanctions module is being expanded to include EU, UK, and other jurisdictions as well. But in the future, we will be announcing additional modules, right? Whether it be data privacy / data protection, cybersecurity, funds, right? Whatever the particular interest area will be. So it's by no means limited to sanctions and export controls. That's just where the demand was greatest in the beginning.
So that comes to an end. Thank you, Mac. It's been a pleasure to have this interaction with you, learn a lot of things, get a lot of insights for this particular 2024 and way forward. But thank you from all of us at ELP. Thank you for this chat and look forward to connecting with you soon.
Of course. Thank you all for your time.